Hello viewers. Today we will be discussing the topic, the political economy of environmental justice. In this lecture, we'll basically try to understand and analyze the interplay among economy, environment, and human well-being. Basically, we'll try to understand the impact of economic decision making on environment and human well-being. In other words, we find that environment is a cause of concern not only for states but also international institutions and transnational organizations. If environment is at the center stage of all agenda, why is it that environmental degradation has affected all corners of the world? Howsoever, we need to understand that we need to protect our environment, but we also need to promote the economy. So what are the aspects and how are we going to balance environment and economy? Political economy basically concerns with the interplay of the polity and the economy in the allocation of scarce resources within an economic system. And when it comes to allocation of scarce resources, we cannot ignore the external environmental factors. The political economy of environment seeks to understand how the economy affects the environment and what could be the possible fallout of it. In order to better understand this area of discussion, we need to pose three important questions. Number one, who wins? Who wins with environmental degradation and economic prosperity? Because we need to understand that there would be some winners and some losers. So who wins is the first question. Second question, who loses with environmental degradation? Who is harmed by environmentally degrading activities? And third, who decides? Why can the beneficiaries of these activities impose environmental costs on the people who harm the environment? In other words, can we have a cost-benefit analysis of environmental harm? Can we provide for some regulations to ensure that people who harm the environment have to bear the cleanup cost for it? So let us try to understand where does the answers lie. Now, in order to answer these three questions that I have just posited, we need to follow a positive agenda and a normative agenda. The positive agenda focuses on what happens and why does this happen. And the normative agenda seeks to provide some curative prescriptions which can prevent environmental damage beyond a particular point. Inequality is the basic norm. Countries are unequal, economies are unequal, systems are unequal, and therefore environmental degradation also does not happen in a uniform manner. So there are three possible factors why those who benefit are able to do so by imposing environmental costs on others. If we try to look into who are benefited, people in the upper echelons of the society are benefited from the environmental degradation that happens. But the cost and the harmful impact is felt on the lower rungs of the society. One possibility of the economy causing environmental degradation could be in the fact that the winners are the people who are living today and the losers are yet to come, which means that the losers are the future generation. So if because of our economic activities we are impacting the environment, the harm may not be immediately felt, but the harm may be felt after successive generations when the winners of today may have died. The second is imperfect information. Do we have information in the society as to who is causing the exact environmental harm? We do not have. And as a result, people who are harming the environment cannot be held liable because we do not have the perfect information. As per the theory of environmental sustainability, the people who degrade the environment should bear the cost. of improving it. But if we are unable to locate the people who are degrading, we can't impose the cost on them. The third important factor is inequality of people at different rungs. For instance, those who bear the cost do not have sufficient purchasing power or political power to prevail in social context over use and abuse of environment. Thus, the inequality is around those who harm the environment and those who bear the effects of environmental harm. Because people who harm the environment and the people who bear the harm of the environment are two different categories. People who harm the environment is usually felt to be politically and economically powerful. People who are harmed by the environment lack this political economic power. Now, why is this concept of inequality so important in this understanding of environmental justice? Now, environmental justice requires an ethic of intergenerational equity. We need to understand that the people who degrade the environment should be morally and ethically responsible for the harm that they have caused to the environment. The second important aspect where we can prevent any sort of inequality is a kind of an environmental education. And in particular, the right to know laws that protect the public's right to information against environmental harms and the right to know who is responsible for the environmental harm in our country. But if we want to reduce inequality, there has to be redistribution of power. There has to be redistribution of power from the upper echelons of the society to the lower. Now, when we are trying to redress environmental harm and when we are bringing in the notion of inequality in terms of political and economic inequality, we have to understand where power lies. Because it is power which shapes not just political decision making but also economic and environmental decision making. And that is the reason why, students, we need to understand that we may have a number of international environmental conferences beginning with the Stockholm Conference in 1972. Thereafter, a number of climate change conferences, but we have not been able to pinpoint countries who should be responsible for environmental harm and degradation. This is all because of a power play between developed countries and developing countries. In this entire narrative of political economy of environmental degradation, we need to understand that the damage, the degradation may have been done by the developed countries, but the cost is being put upon the developing or the third world countries. Now, when we are speaking of environment, an important aspect of environment is environmental decisions. Who takes decisions? Now, environmental decisions are based on both political power and economic power. Political power or economic power is based on monetary valuation of environmental harms in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. Because we need to understand that in the entire concept of environmental degradation, if we do a cost-benefit analysis, who is harmed? Each person does not count, students. It is each dollar counts. So the dollar is an important criteria in this entire decision making around environmental justice. Costs and benefits that go to people with more dollars will receive more weight than if they go to people with less dollars. It's basically the rich-poor dichotomy, where money matters more than people. Another important factor is the power of the states. Can the poor countries prevent the richer countries from engaging and imposing environmental harm on developing countries? It's a question of who has political power in world governance. Decision makers do not necessarily attach the same importance to all benefits and costs as measured by the cost-benefit analysis. And we are doing the cost-benefit analysis, we have to understand Pareto's principle of optimality. We also need to understand that the cost imposed upon the people can be simply ignored. Poor people have to bear the environmental costs. We can give an example of the 2017 case. In 2017, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States of America decided to assign zero value to climate change impacts outside the United States, in mounting a cost-benefit case to repeal an Obama-era policy that could have curbed carbon emission from power plants. So it refused to take any responsibility for the harm done by carbon emission from the power plants in US and if they are having a cascading negative impact on other countries. Now we also need to understand that those who have more economic power, more powerful in terms of deciding international issues, have more political clout, more countries to defend them. Therefore, we need to understand that environmental outcomes are shaped by political inequality of power, economic inequality in terms of costs and benefit, and the same can be deduced in terms of social inequalities of people who are harmed and people who harm. Now, what is the direction of environment harm? We need to understand that we can't have a straitjacket idea that all environment harm is caused by the developed countries to the developing countries. If you remember, Mrs. Gandhi's famous statement at the Stockholm Conference in 1972 that poverty was the worst pollutant. So, poor countries have inbuilt systems or problems which create environmental harms, if not directly, indirectly. In the United States of America, environmental justice researchers have documented systematic disparities in exposure to hazards across the social fault lines of race, caste, gender, ethnicity, class, which means that all people are not uniformly affected by environmental harm. To give you one example, African Americans, Latinos, and low-income communities are more susceptible to more hazardous facilities sited in their midst, and they face disproportionate exposure to pollution. Environmental degradation harms low-income people more because they cannot invest in environmentally expensive gadgets or devices. This is not just the case of United States of America. For instance, if you look into England and Netherlands, poorer and non-white neighborhoods have higher air concentration of particulate matter and nitrogen oxides. If we are speaking of polluting cities, how can we forget India? Delhi, which is a mega city, and where the residents breathe one of the dirtiest air of the world, not all are equally exposed. The poor live in more polluted neighborhoods. They cannot afford air conditioning or air purifiers. They spend most of their working hours outdoors, where pollution is at its highest. At the same time, they receive fewer benefits from the government. They receive fewer benefits in terms of installing environment-safe devices. There can be many other examples of how the poor are susceptible to environmental harm much more than the rich or the urban elite members of the society. And this is true for almost all countries of the world, regardless of advanced or developing countries. Although most research on environmental justice has focused on race, ethnicity, income, power disparities, there are other consequences of environmental degradation also. In some cases, for example, say resource extraction, solid waste disposal, also have disproportionate environmental harm. you will find many social movements emerging around the world centering on resource extraction and causing harm because of the solid waste disposal from such extraction measures. Another important aspect that we feel is that when it comes to gender narrative of environmental harm, if we compare men and women being susceptible to environmental harm, we find women are more susceptible to environmental harm than men. If we look into developing countries of the world, women have to spend a significant amount of the time, cooking time, in trying to arrange fuel and firewood and cooking in conservative polluting environment, where they have to cook either in wood or cropped residues or dung used for cooking. This is especially true in South Asian countries. It is only very recently that we find that the Indian government has come with the Ujjwala scheme in order to provide for LPG connections to ensure women are not susceptible to environmental harm while cooking. The impact of inequality on the total magnitude of the environment degradation has received less attention than what it deserves. Now let us try to address why do we not have uniform results across the countries. One possible reason could be that concentration of environmental cost is concentrated in the lower rungs of the population. Benefits of environmental degradation goes directly to the rich and the propertied, but the harm of environmental degradation is concentrated on one sphere. Another important aspect is this craze for higher profits in industries is also leading to engaging environmentally degrading devices. All countries of the world have not introduced significant measures to put pressure upon the governments as well as multinational corporations to invest in pollution-friendly technology. And as a result, what we find, it is not just industrial establishments of multinational corporations, but also government undertakings which participate in this entire harm of environmental degradation. Let us now try to understand how political economy scholars have impinged upon environmental decision making in terms of 4 criteria. The 4 criteria are efficiency, sustainability, justice, and safety. These 4 criteria try to determine whether environmental activities are cost effective and harm reducing or not. Now, when we try to understand efficiency, environmental efficiency refers to activities that bring about the greatest good of the greatest number in a cost-effective manner. Now, the cost-benefit analysis tends to center on the fact that how much benefit can be accrued at minimum cost. But then we also need to understand that in the Pareto's optimality principle, you can make somebody better or benefit from services, but some people will be worse off in this situation. So the greatest good of the greatest number can come about with some form of negative externalities imposed on others. Therefore, efficiency as a principle focuses on the fact that governments across the world should emphasize on economic efficiency, but without disregarding the concern and cause for environmental sustainable practices. Another group of experts believe that if you want to engage in environment-friendly devices, you need to have huge economic surplus. And this surplus can only come in from developmental efforts. So here there is a contrast. Number 1, development is needed but not at the cost of environment. Environment needs to be protected and promoted, and for that we need to engage in expensive environment-friendly devices. These expensive environment-friendly devices cannot be used or bought by firms if they are not profit-driven. So here the entire dilemma is on the fact that whether we focus on profit and thereby invest in environment friendly devices, or we cut down on profit and ensure environmental sustainability. Now, this varies from one case to another case and one country to another country, because the level of environmental harm is also not uniform. It varies from one country to another country. Another important area where environmental justice seeks to emphasize on is the notion of safety. It is important to engage in economic activities which are safe for the environment. The best and the foremost example where environmental safety was not considered at all was the Bhopal gas tragedy in India, where not just the environment bore the harm, but successive generations of people living in and around the plant also suffered massive health damage. So safety is not just environmental safety, it is also human well-being and safety of the population. In the United States, for example, the Clean Air directs the Environment Protection Agency to establish air quality standards for the protection of public health and welfare while allotting an adequate margin of safety, not to decide on standards by weighing the benefits of protecting public health against the costs. So there are clear-cut legislations which provide for ensuring environmental well-being. We need to focus on the Constitution of South Africa, which clearly provides that every person shall have the right to an environment that is not detrimental to his or her health or well-being. We also need to understand that countries have come out with various forms of legislations to provide for environmental safety. In India, we have the Environment Protection Act, we have the Air Act, Water Act, we also have national environmental policies which have been adopted from time to time, engaging with concerns of safety and well-being of the population. The economics of implementing the safety criteria are relatively straightforward. It is not given anywhere the economist will not provide for environment-friendly measures. All that is required is a fact that the cost and benefit should be commensurate with each other. Another very popular area of discussion in this entire debate on environmental justice is the question of sustainability. The Brundtland Commission in 1987 expressed the idea that in terms of human needs, sustainable development should be at the core of political governance and economic governance. It is the duty of states to enforce legislations to ensure that economic development happens in a sustained manner. There should not be over-exploitation of natural resources, which leaves the future generations without access to any resource. The sustainability criteria departs markedly from the neoclassical efficiency model, where the well-being of the future generations is handled by discounting future costs and benefit to obtain their present values. For the neoclassical economists, the present is more important than the future, and the present generation will create so much of wealth and new human well-being that the future generation needs will always be taken care of. We need to understand that the concept of sustainability also addresses the issue of ethicality or ethical measures in economic governance. Another important area so far as environment is concerned is the concept of justice. Justice is considered to be the central normative goal in the political economy of the environment. Ultimately, political economy operates around the ideals of justice. Justice implies to give each man his due. And environmental benefits should be equally distributed among all. Every person, regardless of his caste, class, race, gender, ethnicity, has the right to live in a clean and safe environment, has the right to breathe pure air. And that is what justice takes into consideration. The distribution of environmental cost and benefit is definitely important. Without development, sustaining environment is also difficult. Gone are the days when we can live in the life of the jungle amidst nature. We need nature, at the same time we also need developmental imperatives. Whereas sustainability addresses intergenerational equity, justice addresses intragenerational equity. It seeks to provide for the dues of people present at one point of time in a particular country. Whereas the safety criteria aims to promote and protect public health, justice seeks to ensure that environmental health is promoted and distributed across all rungs of the human population. Higher levels of environmental degradation are linked to wider disparities of wealth and power. It has been observed that environmental degradation is also a cause for wealth disparities across population. At least we need to understand that if we can reduce the disparities in political and economic power, that will have a beneficial impact on how environmental justice is seen as and implemented. What are the key deductions that we can get from today's discussion? Number one, the political economy of the environment seeks to deepen our understanding of the interplay between environment, economy, and human well-being. Second, in contrast to new classical economics, it pays attention not just to the net magnitude of cost and benefit, but also to the distribution of the cost and benefit. Thirdly, in the realm of positive analysis, which means how the real world works, this means exploring the multiple ways in which the distribution of wealth and income affect the environment. Number four, the political economy of environment also posits our relationship with nature is complete and we cannot live a life outside nature. The next important key deduction is the fact that the cost of environment degradation do not fall randomly across the population. Another important deduction is the fact that negative externalities, as is called by the neoclassical economics, are not impersonal side effects of economic activities. They have a larger story to say. In fact, the dispersion of economic and environmental gains and losses happens across different layers of societal living. In our understanding of the political economy of environmental justice, we need to understand two core realities. One, environmental degradation is not uniform around the world, and that it affects population in different ways. Number two, the economy has to play a greater role in ensuring that the environmental damage which has been caused in the last few decades can be suitably rectified with proper political decisions and economic help. Finally, the political economy of environment deals with some urgent problems that need to be solved in order to ensure that the future generations do not suffer because of the losses and the harm caused by the decision makers, the market, and the state today. It is the duty of the political decision makers as well as the economists and researchers to engage in finding out a solution to ensure that environment degradation can be curbed so that the future generation can enjoy human well-being, safety, and an environment which is just for them. That's all for today. Thank you.